to welcome our guest, David Anderson. He's an assistant professor of anthropological sciences at Radford University. He received his PhD in anthropology from Tulane University in 2010 with a focus on the archaeology of the ancient Maya, and his traditional research investigates the growth of political complexity among the Maya and the role the Maya ballgame may have played in community identity. Over the past 5 years, Dr. Anderson has become increasingly engaged in understanding conspiracy theories and pseudo-archaeological claims that misrepresent the ancient world. To combat these claims, he's published academic articles, given public lectures, and plunged into the world of social media. Wherever there's an ancient aliens meme, he will be there. So let us warmly welcome David tonight.
Thank you. Is that good? Can everybody hear me? All right. Thank you, Dr. Pozorski, for inviting me to be here tonight to speak to you all, and thank you all for coming out. I believe everyone would be rather hanging out on the quad tonight, right? It's nice out there, so I appreciate you coming inside and listening to me for an hour tonight. Yes, so I'm here as an archaeologist to talk about not archaeology, in essence, I guess is the short story. I have gotten very interested, and I have a long history of trying to engage with and better understand these things that I would call pseudo-archaeology. It's important to me from the get-go to try and define that term to a certain extent, because anytime you slap pseudo onto the front of something, pseudoscience or some other sundry topic, there's a tendency people think, oh, you're just dismissing it. You don't like that interpretation. You don't want that interpretation. You are the mainstream archaeologist who's here to sort of quash all of our fun. That's not what I mean. There's an actual difference in terms of the kind of claims that I want to talk about tonight, where they employ different sets of methodology than archaeology does. So it might look like archaeology if you don't have a lot of experience with archaeology. It certainly makes claims about the ancient world, but it makes use of different data sets. It ignores certain things like, the classic examples are things like cherry picking, right? Where they'll pick up a few small bits of data that they think might be of interest to them and ignore all the rest of the stuff that might contradict their claims. Sometimes there's, I think one of the biggest mistakes that pseudo-archaeology usually makes is to completely ignore chronology. So I have a lot of people who ask me all the time, well, what about pyramids? I mean, the Egyptians at Giza, they built pyramids, right? And the Maya, they built pyramids, so there must be something going on there between them, right? And my first thought in my head is like, well, there's about 3,000 years in between the structures that you're talking about. So that's a huge time gap for us to fill in with some sort of explanation. So I think there's a fundamental problem in the methodologies going on here usually. The two examples I like to give to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page, one of the most common expressions of pseudo-archaeological claims these days are Atlantis. It is particularly when people try to claim that Atlantis was a brick and mortar real world place. It wasn't. If you want to know more, we can go way deep on Atlantis in the Q&A after here. What I really thought I should talk about tonight, though, is this stuff. Ancient alien claims. This is hands down one of the most prevalent pseudo-archaeological claims that is out there today. If you are unlike me and haven't been sort of bathed in this stuff, the basic idea here is that people are claiming that the archaeological record, in one way or another, includes evidence for alien contact, or contact with extraterrestrials, shall we say. This idea has been most thoroughly popularized by these two sources up here. We have the Ancient Alien that is on History Channel today. It started, we'll come around here towards the end of the talk, it started in 2009, and they are now in their 14th season, which just kind of makes me cringe every time I realize they're that far along and they're still on air. But truly, the TV show owes a huge debt to the book on the right-hand side of the screen here, Eric von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods, which was published back in 1968. When the show debuted back in 2009, it was deliberately debuted as an homage to Eric von Daniken, and he is one of the executive producers on the show to this day. So the claim is that there's evidence for ancient alien contact, right? And the types of they engage with, they like religious texts, and so there's a strong strong theme from Eric von Daniken's book through to the TV show today to take religious texts and claim that they are, any religious spiritual incident is some way, shape, or form a misunderstood alien contact. In fact, Giorgio Tsoukalos, the guy with the hair, who's in all the memes, literally just about a year ago, he told an audience that every single religious experience that anyone has had is a misunderstood alien contact. So there's a very hardcore thing going on there. But when it comes to archaeology, they have a tendency to look at things and say sort of two things. One of their claims is to look at any stone and say, well, that stone right there is too big, and people couldn't have moved it, and so ergo it must have been aliens. I love those claims because they never test them. They never actually put the stones on a scale to say how much does it weigh or anything like that. One of my favorite examples out there really is the Stonehenge. The site of Stonehenge today invites school children on the equinox to come and visit the site and move a rock. Not one of the rocks in the actual henge, but they bring in an example rock that weighs about 3 to 4 tons, and they let the third graders move it around. Because it's not that hard to move these rocks, actually. It takes effort, it takes organization, but even school children can do it. The other thing that they tend to do is take ancient art and I would say rip it out of its context and ask you to squint your eyes and look at it and say, doesn't this look like an astronaut or an alien or a UFO in some way, shape, or form? And this, I think, is one of the sort of more egregious forms of misrepresentation that happens here. They don't ask you what the people who made it might have thought about it. They don't compare it to other examples of art from that culture. They pull it out of its context. And so in the center of my screen tonight is one of the classic examples that shows up in von Daniken's book and has showed up on the TV show. This is the sarcophagus lid of the Maya king Pakal that was found at the site of Palenque. And the claim has been, if you see him, he's in the center there, right? He's sort of leaning back and his hands are all in disarray. And so the claim for many decades now has been, well, obviously he's an astronaut in a rocket ship, right? He's leaning back because the jets are about to blast off and put him up in space. I would dare to say if we want to understand this piece of art, maybe we should compare it to other examples of Maya art and see if there are common themes to help us better understand it. And sure enough, right at the center of this piece, so if you look sort of rising up from his navel, going straight up, we have an image that is known as the world tree. So it is broken on the right-hand side here. This is an incredibly common image in Maya art, where you'll have a central trunk and you'll have two branches coming out. This actually resembles the ceiba tree, which is a particular type of tree that grows in the Maya world. You have to go like 2/3 of the way up of a ceiba tree before its branches come out, and they come out at right angles. There's always a bird up at the top, so there's a bird with lots of long feathers up there. And then there's always this face down at the bottom. What's going on, there's a nose in the center, and then there are two eyes on either side. So that's the nose, those are the eyes, and then these over here are jade earplugs. If you think people like big piercings now, you should go back to the Maya, because oh my goodness, they would just shove everything they could. They would even drill holes in their teeth and put jade into their teeth and whatnot. Body modification, you ain't seen nothing yet. So this image, this world tree image is actually really common. So this is another example of that same world tree, also from Palenque. This is one building over. So if you want to know more about Maya art, they could have gone one building over, but they didn't bother to do that. They grabbed this one image and ripped it out of its context. The drawing on the right here is an analysis from Linda Sheely, an art historian who has been studying Maya art and iconography for her whole life. And back in the 1970s, she made a sort of serious study of world tree iconography. And what she posited is that, that the world tree sits at the center of the universe, or the cosmos, in the Maya imagination, the Maya religious worldview. And that it sits in the center of the universe, and there are directions all around us. But particularly of interest to us today is that the world tree also connects us to the spiritual world that is above us, where that bird always is, and it connects us to the spiritual world that is below us, where that face always is. This is the cosmos for the Maya. And so what do we really have with Pakal's sarcophagus lid? It's a sarcophagus lid, right? It's literally laying on top of his mortal remains. And what do we see? We see a Maya king who is falling at the center of the universe and falling from his world where the tree exists down to the world below, down to where this monstrous mask or this divine image is below him. This is not hell, by the way, I should say. The world below us is not a bad thing for the Maya. It is simply another element of existence, and it is part of the afterlife. This is a Maya ruler falling to the underworld at his moment of death. I think that makes a fair bit of sense if we can put it all in its context. And so, done, right? I can go home, we're all done, it's good. This is the thing. Like, nothing that I just said is new. We have known about this stuff for decades. Eric von Däniken, when his book came out in 1968, was immediately debunked by multiple scholars, pointing out the errors in logic and the things that he left out and the ways in which he distorted images. We've been debunking this stuff for decades. My next slide, the next slide is the very, very depressing slide. So, there's been a survey going on by Chapman University over the last few years that, in particular, the bottom line here is asking about ancient alien belief. How many Americans think that there is evidence in the archaeological record for ancient alien contact? It has doubled since 2015. We are at 41%. Unfortunately, they didn't ask this question in 2019, so I don't have any new data to add on here, but they told me they will ask it again in 2020. In 2018, 41% of Americans said, yes, there is evidence for ancient alien contact. When's the last time 41% of Americans agreed on anything? And right now, 41% of Americans agrees that my profession is lying to you. I tell my colleagues all the time, this is horrible news. And I think in the last year, I'm finally getting through to some people. I'm like, well, we need to talk about this stuff. My central sort of premise here is that if we ignore a problem, it won't be fixed, it won't go away. And so we need to engage this problem. So my thoughts on pseudo-archaeology, ancient aliens, Atlantis, actually, since it's on the screen here, let me just say, there is the upper line there is a belief in Atlantis. And you will note it is much higher. It actually says that 57% of Americans believe in Atlantis. There's at least a little bit of an issue at hand here because the question as it reads in the survey is, do you believe Atlantis, ancient advanced civilizations such as Atlantis exist? And so when you add that such as, I think it opens a lot of possibilities for how people might choose to answer that question. So it's a little harder to know exactly what to do with that 57% believing in Atlantis issue is. But my premise here has been, well, we've debunked these things over and over and over again. And belief's not going down, it's actually going up. And so I think we need a richer level of engagement here. I think we need to examine the context in which these ideas originate, how they grow and change over time, and what sort of influences them as they change over time. And so a lot of the papers and publications and a book that I'm working on has been doing is to try and tease this idea out. What is the cultural context that these ideas appear in, and how do they grow and spread? And what's supporting them? If the evidence isn't supporting them, what is causing these beliefs to be so popular and so widespread? So I would like to talk about a narrow slice of that tonight. I would like to talk about what I call truth fiction in the world of ancient aliens. This concept of truth fiction I am borrowing from this gentleman, or I'm modifying, heavily from this gentleman. Charles Fort was a prominent author in the 19-teens and 1920s, writing about paranormal claims. I make my students read him every semester. Right now you are glad you are not my student, because this guy went crazy, and quite literally. And what drove him around the bend was that Charles Fort is what I would call a philosophical skeptic. As far as he was concerned, there is no path to knowledge. There is absolutely no way for you to know that my shirt is white, because someone, actually he literally wrote this, a thought beam from Mars might be screwing with you right now and making you think you see my shirt as white, but it's actually some other color. Charles Fort could not settle on any vision of reality that was knowable, and that drives anyone nuts, right? And so he writes and rants about this in all of his books. In one of his books, he used this phrase. He said, there is no such thing as truth, and there is no such thing as fiction. There is only the hyphenated state of truth fiction. And by this hyphenated state of truth fiction, what Fort meant was that you cannot know anything. There is nothing real, there's nothing unreal. I take that a little differently. And I examine this, one, I tell my students all the time, and one of the good things about truth fiction is, like, if you're going to write a fictional story, you need to have some truth in there, right? If you're going to write a good novel, it needs to connect with your audience. It needs to talk about issues that are real and important to them. So any good fiction needs some truth in it. And I would argue that any, truth, any scientific paper or presentation that you give needs the elements of a good story in it too. If you want to engage your audience and get them interested, you need to be a good storyteller. You need to know something about fiction if your interest is truth as well. But I see something in studying paranormal beliefs and in studying pseudo-archaeological beliefs. I see what I would call a Fortean truth fiction. And what I mean by that is I see claims like ancient aliens, and I see them show up in some sources where people say, hey, this is real. And then I see them again in other sources where people say, hey, this is just fiction, we're just having fun. And then it doesn't happen once or twice, it happens over and over and over again, where the same claim is showing up in sources that say it's real and the others that say it's fiction, and then real and fiction and real and fiction back and forth. And I argue when you get that kind of repetitious blur, where you're going back and forth between truth and fiction, that it creates a situation, it creates doubt in all of our minds, where you've heard about these things, but you don't remember, was that a movie you saw it in, or was it a documentary you saw it in? Was that in a book? Was it in a textbook, or was it in that comic book that you saw? If you don't obsess over this stuff every day like I do, you can't quite remember exactly where you heard some of these things. And I think that we have a very distinct set of examples of this kind of truth fiction when it comes to ancient alien claims. So I want to go way back tonight, and I want to start back in 1895, and I want to take us to Mars. In 1895, Percival Lowell published a book called Mars, in which he posited that across the surface of Mars was a series of artificial canals. Now this is back in the 1890s when telescopes were not as good as they are today, and astronomers were just starting to look at Mars and just starting to discern different features on the planet. And there was actually an Italian astronomer who in the 1870s had first suggested there were canals of some kind on Mars. And it's possible that the Italian astronomer was simply suggesting there were waterways, like natural waterways or something on Mars. But Percival Lowell took this very explicitly to say that there were artificially constructed canals on the surface of Mars, and he attempted to map them out. Lowell, by the way, was a very serious astronomer. This was not a flight of fancy. This was, in a very real sense, this was an issue that the telescopes weren't very good, and he was doing the best he could with the observations he was making. In his book, Mars, Lowell goes on to suggest these are artificial canals and that they were built by a desperate race of Martians who had moved into the subterranean regions of the planet, and they had built these canals to try and siphon any last dregs of water they could off of the polar ice caps. So these canals were this Martian race's last attempt at survival. Lowell's ideas spawned H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, which is about Martians coming to Earth and trying to invade the planet Earth. H.G. Wells' novel comes out in 1897, but what I really want to talk about is not, Wells is a great book. If you haven't read War of the Worlds, please go home and read War of the Worlds right after this. In 1898, a less good book comes out by Garrett Serviss. Garrett Serviss was also a fictional author, and actually Garrett Serviss wrote his own version of War of the Worlds, where he basically just plagiarized Wells and reprinted it, and it sold, and he made some money. And so he decided to write a sequel. And so he wrote this book, Edison's Conquest on Mars, which in essence is a sequel to his plagiarized version of War of the Worlds. And in this book, the humans take the fight to Mars. And so they load up on a spaceship and they head out to the Red Planet, and they take the fight to the Martians. And there's a very interesting passage, a very short set in this book, where when the humans arrive on Mars, they encounter some more humans. And they hear a tremendous story from these guys. They have been there, or their ancestors have been there for 9,000 years. And that their ancestors had been stolen from the planet Earth and brought to Mars by this ancient Martian race. And They tell us that while the Martians were on Earth 9,000 years ago, they built the Pyramid of Giza and they built the Sphinx. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time anyone said aliens built the pyramids. It shows up not in someone trying to claim this is real, but in someone trying to claim this is just a fictional story in one way, shape, or form. This brings me, I want to take a slight aside and step back a few years to 1888 to talk about this woman, Helena Blavatsky. Helena Blavatsky was a devoted spiritualist who brings her own set of information to this story. Blavatsky in the 1870s founded a group known as the Theosophical Society. Their headquarters are in Wheaton, Illinois, not all that far from here today. There's a lot to talk about in terms of Blavatsky. She was very interested in the ancient world, but in a very particular way, she adds to this ancient aliens discourse. Because in her book, The Secret Doctrine, which she published in 1888, she wrote about what she called the transition of the human race from what she called the fourth race to the fifth race. She believed there were a series of progressions that all humans had gone through, and that you and I were members of the fifth race, but that our ancestors had been these members of the fourth race. Incidentally, she talks a lot about spiritual matters, and she talks a lot in her books about psychic powers and psychic gifts. And for her, the occasional person coming along who had a psychic talent of some kind, to her that was evidence that humanity was on the verge of moving into the sixth race. But back in the fourth race, we were uneducated, shall we say. We did not know much about science, religion, and philosophy. But in our transition, how we transitioned from the fourth to the fifth race, she talks about spirits coming from beyond this planet and coming to the earth and instructing us in the ways of civilization. She talks about those spirits taking on rulership roles in ancient societies like Egypt and the Maya. She lays out a story that is very similar to the ancient alien story today, that these extraterrestrials came and helped people learn how to build architecture and pyramids and other monuments and whatnot. But for Blavatsky, this is all very spiritual and not even necessarily physical in the whole process. Now, there's a very key point here for tonight. Blavatsky claims to have learned all of this from something she called the Book of Zion. And she claimed that the Book of Zion was an ancient Tibetan text that she had access to and was reading and translating. And so much of the Secret Doctrine is allegedly a translation of the Book of Zion. There's a small problem here for some of us because no copy of the Book of Zion has ever been found. And so for Blavatsky and her supporters to this day, that's not necessarily a problem because for many of her supporters, she could have had some sort of psychical connection to this book and could have sort of channeled this book. But to me, I'm this problematic materialist, and so to me it bothers me that no physical copy of this book has ever been found. Which brings me back into the world of fiction and into the world of H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft is one of, if you're not familiar, is one of the most seminal horror writers in American history. He wrote numerous short stories in the 1920s and 1930s, and Lovecraft was very interested in making his stories as frightening as possible. And one of the ways he would try to do that was to bring in real-world details. And he wanted to make sure, in particular when he wrote about the occult, to make sure it sounded realistic in one way, shape, or form. And so he decided to adopt the Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society, as sort of his go-to reference for what do occultists believe. And in fact, if you read his most famous story, Lovecraft's most famous story, The Call of Cthulhu, it is rife with references to the Theosophical Society and theosophical beliefs. So Lovecraft actually takes up Blavatsky's spirits from beyond this world, but he transforms them, and he refers to them as the Old Ones. And in Lovecraft's writings, the Old Ones are tremendously powerful entities that have come from beyond this planet, and they are frightening. For Blavatsky, they are hopeful. For Lovecraft, they are frightening. And Lovecraft imagines that cults grew up around these Old Ones, worshiping them. And so he sort of turns, in that sense, he turns these ancient spirits or these Old Ones into deities of one kind or another. He turns them into frightening deities at that. Lovecraft also, in his attempts to make everything as realistic as possible, Lovecraft cites the Book of Zion in several of his stories. And this is actually a game card from a H.P. Lovecraft-inspired board game of modern origin, where they have reproduced one of the cards for the game being the Book of Zion, because it comes up in his stories every once in a while, because he wants people to know that he is engaged with these real-world details. Now, something interesting happens with Lovecraft. His stories are fantastic. They sell, they're scary, he is a foundational figure in American horror. But for some people, his stories were so realistic that they started to argue that Lovecraft was actually telling the truth, but disguising it as fiction. Some of the most influential people who took up this stance were Louis Paul and Jacques Berger, two French authors. Paul and Berger actually were the first people to take up Lovecraft's stories and translate them into French and introduce them to the Francophone world. And they were so fascinated with Lovecraft's ideas that they actually founded this magazine on the left side here called Planet. Planet was basically a magazine that was half devoted to Lovecraft and translating and publishing Lovecraft stories, and half devoted to spiritualism. That is, half devoted to what they thought was real in Lovecraft's stories. And in 1960, these two gentlemen published this book, The Morning of the Magicians. And The Morning of the Magicians solidifies a lot of these things that Blavatsky started. In particular, it says that aliens, we go physical here now all of a sudden, aliens in silver ships came to this earth and instructed our ancestors and taught them in the ways of building and how to do things like build pyramids and whatnot. And interestingly enough, once again, Powell and Berger tell us that they learned this from the Book of Zion. They also say that they have a copy of this book in some way, shape, or form that they're reading from and learning more about than Blavatsky had been able to tell us. So this is one of my favorite sets of trios, right, where we're moving from factual to fiction to factual explanations of these things. Around the same time, in 1959, we see a fantastic shift in the comic book world. The pulp fiction era that Lovecraft was a part of kept churning, and through the 30s and into the 40s, we see all kinds of science fiction stories coming out of the pulp fiction world that deal with aliens, and they occasionally touch on things that we might call ancient aliens. But in 1959, we have a beautiful example that comes to us from the world of comic books that were growing up out of that world of pulp fiction. In 1959, DC Comics, just DC, right? Detective Comics, introduces a new character, Rip Hunter, who is this great sort of classic time traveler. He's got his own time pod that there it is up there, that he travels around in, and he can move backwards and forwards through time, investigating mysteries. And lo and behold, in his second issue, he went to Atlantis. And his third issue, he goes back to ancient Egypt. And the reason Rip Hunter goes back to ancient Egypt is that someone shows him a tablet from ancient Egypt that looks like it has aliens on it. It's exactly what von Daniken and others are doing in the ancient alien world. Rip Hunter in 1959, before von Daniken published his book, sees a tablet from ancient Egypt, and he's like, I think that's got an alien on it. But since he's a time traveler, they go hop into their pod and they go back in time and see what they can find out. And sure enough, they get to ancient Egypt and they find these two alien outlaws in Egypt. They're not there building the pyramids or anything like that this time. They are simply there hiding out from the alien law enforcement. But there's a very interesting thing that happens here. When Erich von Daniken published his book about ancient aliens, he said two things, actually. He said that humans would be incapable of recognizing aliens as anything but gods. That we wouldn't in any way, shape, or form be able to understand them as other life forms, but that we would assume they must be gods. And at the same time, he suggested that any of their technology would have been so advanced that our ancestors would have been forced to assume that it was magic and not technology in some sense. And sure enough, here in 1959, about 9 years before von Daniken wrote this, what happens when Rip Hunter shows up in ancient Egypt? Everyone immediately assumes that he is a god because he's coming in this flying machine. And they tell him there are these other gods here at the same time. We get another good one in 1967, still one more year before Erich von Daniken published his book. Over in Marvel Comics, in the Fantastic Four, we have the introduction of the Kree. If you're familiar with Marvel's blue-skinned aliens, they show up for the very first time in 1967 in issue 64 of the Fantastic Four, where this is important. There's an interesting echo here. I believe that Jack Kirby helped to write these issues, but it's not entirely clear who helped to write each issue in Marvel's Silver Age. At the beginning of Fantastic Four number 64, there is this doddering old archaeology professor who has become convinced that there's an alien spaceport lost beneath some archaeological ruins down in South America. And so he travels down to South America to find these ruins. And sure enough, when he finds them, and he finds the spaceport underneath those ruins. And when he finds the spaceport, he accidentally wakens up this guy, a giant alien robot who was left there to protect the spaceport by the Kree. The Fantastic Four swoop in, defeat the robot, and our archaeology professor is okay and survives. In the very next issue, the character Ronan the Accuser is introduced, who has also been in a lot of the movies recently. Ronan the Accuser is a judge from this alien Kree race, and he shows up to find out what has happened to their robot and how it got destroyed. Ronan says something very interesting in this issue, as far as I'm concerned. He says that Kree technology is so advanced that it will appear as virtual magic to you. So he's setting this trope up that Von Däniken hasn't even written about yet, that alien tech must be magical in our eyes. Then finally, in 1968, after all of these things, we get the seminal ancient alien book, Chariots of the Gods by Erich von Däniken, where he argues that there's evidence for alien contact in the archaeological record. And ultimately, he says some pretty nasty things on occasions, like our ancestors were not terribly smart, and that they had progressed hardly at all before the spacemen arrived, educating and mating with the dim proto-humans. Because apparently that's what you do after you've been on a spaceship for a long time. So here's the thing. Even when von Däniken's book came out, people knew this wasn't a new idea. In fact, von Däniken got dragged into court for plagiarism by the authors of Morning of the Magicians. And they settled out of court, so we never know quite how that all works out, right? Settling out of the court doesn't necessarily mean that the court would have found him guilty of plagiarism. But what we do know is that all subsequent editions of Chariots of the Gods had some new references added to it, including Morning of the Magicians, as well as another book by Robert Charot. People who had been writing about ancient aliens before von Däniken did took him to court, and he seems to have been guilty of plagiarizing these ideas from them. So in other words, there was nothing new coming out here, but what was different is that Erich von Däniken's book sold like hotcakes. Morning of the Magicians was a small niche book that not that many people read. Chariots of the Gods sold millions of copies and was translated into something like 30-odd different languages. This was an international bestseller, and it launched von Däniken's career. He continued to write books all through the 1970s. He actually continues to write books all the way to this day. He's still alive. In an interesting little tidbit for us, in his second book, Gods from Outer Space in 1970, von Däniken reveals one of his sources for where he's getting all this information about ancient aliens coming to Earth, the Book of Zion, which still no one has found a copy of, but apparently Erich von Däniken got to read it and was able to tell us a little bit more about where ancient alien life was coming from. Throughout the 70s, actually there's a couple of other authors that start to get in on this game. We see Robert Temple and Zachariah Sitchin start writing ancient alien books. This idea starts to hop. But what I find particularly interesting is in 1976, we have another new comic book come out. This time we know definitely from the mind of Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby's The Eternals. The Eternals was written deliberately as a comic book homage to Erich von Däniken's ideas. They do some very explicit parallelisms. This is in reference to Pakal's sarcophagus lid, the rocket ship where we started tonight. And Kirby tells us that this is an homage to Erich von Däniken. And here's the funny thing. The opening pages to this comic book are virtually identical to the opening pages to Fantastic Four number 64. It starts with a doddering old archaeology professor who's convinced that there's an alien spaceport under a ruin down in South America somewhere. And so he travels down there and finds it, and sure enough, he finds the spaceport under the ruin. But this time, instead of being attacked by a robot, he's attacked by someone called the Deviants. In Jack Kirby's world, gods came to the earth. The gods came to the earth. They're called the Celestials eventually in this language, and they engineered humans through genetic engineering, because I'm guessing the comic authority didn't want to approve the mating with the dim proto-humans part. So Kirby decided to switch that up into a little bit of genetic engineering. When the gods created humans, they also created the deviants, who are in essence devils, and they created the gods, they created the Eternals, who are what humans have called gods over the years. The Greek gods, Egyptian gods, Mayan deities, all of these things. This is very similar to Eric von Däniken. This is what Eric von Däniken was doing in his own book. All human religious figures are just aliens. And that's literally what Kirby starts laying out on these pages. Interestingly, the next year, von Däniken seems to have liked this comic book idea, and so he starts producing his own comic books about his own ideas. So these are comic books, but they're supposed to be true, where Kirby's were comic books that are not really true, but based on true ideas, blah, blah, blah. It gets confusing, right? If you don't sort of obsessively track this stuff down, it all gets a little confusing. Then another thing happened in the 70s. In 1976, this photo was beamed back to Earth from Voyager 1. The first time we had sent a probe to check out Mars, and it sent back this picture from the Cydonia region on Mars, and everybody got excited. Like, oh my God, there really are structures on Mars in some way. Like, the canals are gone, but we've got a human face, a human face of some kind going on here, right? This got a lot of people all of a sudden very interested in these old ideas of Martian canals, and maybe there's alien architects out there in some way, shape, or form, and these ideas start spinning and ultimately coalesce in this fantastic chart. There's nothing I love better than a chart with lines running in every which direction with no real explanations as to why. This was an article from Omni magazine positing that the Cydonia region on Mars was not just an artificial carved face here in the center, but that all of these other features must also be artificial structures in one way, shape, or form as well. What I mean to suggest, basically, as I said, there are some other authors that get into the game here too. By the 70s and into the 80s, alien architecture really starts to cook in a lot of people's minds. It's showing up in prominent pop culture. It's showing up in conspiracy circles and elsewhere in regular intervals. All of this coalesces very nicely in 1994 with the movie Stargate. This was a blockbuster movie that ultimately spawned 3 separate TV franchises that posited a very similar ancient alien story. In fact, there are some elements to the Stargate film that are extremely identical to Garrett Service's Edison's Conquest of Mars, written 100 years earlier. So the basic plot, if you've not seen this movie, is that at the beginning of the story, they find this giant circle in Egypt and don't know what to do with it. And they eventually figure out that it is a Stargate, that if they turn it on, which they dial it like an old rotary phone, and all of a sudden, poof, you have a gate to another planet. And so the humans send some explorers, some military explorers, kind of like Edison's Conquest of Mars. When the military goes to Mars to conquer Mars, we see some military folks going through the Stargate and travel to they don't know where, and they end up on an alien planet. And what do they find there? They find humans. Humans who have been there for thousands of years, whose ancestors have been brought there from Earth by the aliens. And it turns out that their ancestors have been forced to build pyramids for these aliens. We have sort of like an identical plot structure going on here to this old 1894 book. Ultimately, this is a movie that solidifies all of these ideas in pop culture, right? That the Egyptian leaders and gods, or Egyptian pharaohs and deities and everything were just aliens in one way, shape, or form. All of these ideas, it spins, as I said, not just one movie, but into 3 TV shows. And this movie ultimately populates our modern pop culture world and distributes ancient alien ideas sort of all through science fiction in the present day. But of course, people don't stop claiming these things are real. One of my favorite books comes out in 1999 by this man, Graham Hancock. Hancock is far better known for claiming things about a lost civilization on Earth. Most of Hancock's books claim that there is a civilization 10 to 12,000 years ago that I'm very, very actively trying to hide from you guys. Unfortunately, the evidence is just not there. But in '99, he took a brief sojourn to talk about something different. And he basically was talking about this old Sidonian geometry. He was saying that there is evidence for architecture on Mars, and he posits that there is a connection between this architecture on Mars and his lost civilization on Earth, and ultimately from that lost civilization forward through Egypt. Fortunately or unfortunately, a couple years later, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter took a swipe over Mars and took a slightly better photo of this face on Cydonia. And we see there's a much nicer resolution. You can kind of see where the eye was and kind of see where the mouth was. But unless you want to say that NASA is in on all of this, it would seem that this never actually was a human face of any kind, but instead was simply a natural landform that, yeah, kind of has some human face type characteristics, but probably doesn't actually bear out all that much. So it is after all of this, only after all of this, do we finally end up back in 2009 when this TV show debuts and continues to this day. Repeating all of the same old claims that von Däniken has been making, but particularly what I'd like to emphasize tonight is that they don't just produce a TV show. Ancient Aliens has become particularly savvy about how they reach out beyond the television market, because not that many of us have cable TV subscriptions anymore, and Netflix is carrying Ancient Aliens now, but that's just happened in the last few months, I believe. So they've been doing a lot of other things. You can get their mobile game, where you can get a nice handheld game where you too can find the evidence that the aliens were actually here. They've got, I love it, they have a coloring book. Featuring, of course, Pakal's sarcophagus lid. They have a couple of other books specifically geared towards children as well, which always leaves me feeling a little concerned. And the thing that I find most fascinating now, von Däniken saw the value in comic books, right? And he started to produce his own comic books to try and spread his message. The TV show has seen the value of Comic-Con. And History Channel now holds an annual Alien Con, where they encourage people to come dressed in costumes, where there are panels and people willing to sell you all kinds of alien gear, and you can have your chance to meet the stars and take photos with the stars of the TV show and everything else. Alien Con very much follows in this mode, right, where they're trying to do this, treat this as pop culture, and in particular, they're trying to treat this, in essence, as a worldview that you can belong to, where you can find fellow people like yourself who share similar ideas and ideologies. There's a niche bubble they're trying to create in all of this. So where does that really leave us? I'm imagining that you haven't heard a lot of the authors I've talked about tonight, and you maybe haven't seen all of the pop culture I've talked about tonight. But there's the funny thing about ideas, is that they float around and you hear little bits and pieces of them at different parts of your lives, and they form images and templates in our minds. And they influence the way we look at and try to understand the world. One of my favorite examples of this is this test that was done in the early 2000s by Susan Renaud, which she called the Draw an Archaeologist test. Renaud is an archaeologist herself, and she was very interested in educating the public about archaeology and what archaeologists do. And so she was going around giving public lectures at high schools and sometimes at colleges and telling students what archaeology is all about. But before each of her lectures, she would ask people who had come to attend the talk, could you draw an archaeologist? What does an archaeologist look like? And there are two things that I think are important to take away from this. One, she herself was a woman, and she was a woman of color. And she was standing in front of the audience telling them about archaeology. And sure enough, I think it's like 95% of the drawings that were handed in to her were of white men. So there's a very interesting thing going on here. You've got an archaeologist right in front of you, and I ask you, what does an archaeologist look like? And you draw somebody who looks very different from the person standing in front of you. There's something going on here about mental templates and what we expect authority figures to look like and what we expect professors or archaeologists to look like. The other thing that hits what I'm talking about tonight is that a number of them look like Indiana Jones. And she also asked some of these students, have you seen Indiana Jones? And most of them hadn't. This was in the really wonderful period of time before Crystal Skull came out. And people were starting to, have not seen Indiana Jones, and unfortunately since then everyone has, and the new movies, it's bad, right? We can agree on that. This is what I'm on about though, right? You don't have to have seen all of these movies. You don't have to have heard of all of these authors to carry around little tidbits in your head about what these things look like. Ancient alien belief is, let's be honest, skyrocketing. It has doubled in the last 5 years. Debunking the logical fallacies that are shown in the TV show or shown in the books that are published about this hasn't really done us very much. And so what I'm positing tonight, what I hope to do with a talk like this, is to shine some light on where these ideas came from and how they grew and how they were fostered and how they changed. To shine some light on this sort of web of Fortean truth fiction and hopefully dispel some of the myths about where these things come from. Because here's the thing, it's not going to stop anytime soon. Ancient Aliens is still airing episodes once a week, and they get about 1 million viewers each week, which is way more than, we don't have 1 million people here, right? They get way more viewers than I ever do. And the fiction's not about to stop either. The next movie coming out from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Marvel has been producing massive multi-million-dollar blockbuster movies. It's going to be the Eternals. The ancient aliens of the Marvel Universe are back and here before our eyes in about a year. It'll be in the movies in front of you. So I hope when this movie comes out, maybe you'll tell your friends, like, hey, is this the thing? I'm not trying to like dish on these guys. I love Marvel. I've got a huge comic collection at home. This is my stuff. I love this stuff. But we need to understand where it comes from, what the messages underneath it might be saying. And ultimately, what I would argue, you should believe in humans. Remember Eric von Däniken? He said our ancestors were dumb. He literally says they were not very smart. Our ancestors were amazing. It's the fundamental thing I tell people all the time. If you look at the pyramids and say, good God, how could people have built that? It must have been aliens. Just think how much more amazing it's going to be when we walk you through the archaeology and show you that it was people who built that. Thank you very much for being here tonight. I appreciate your time and patience and happy for all kinds of questions. Although, yeah, there was a discussion of one existing. Any questions in the front where we can, are people willing to shout if while we're waiting for that?
So David?
Yes. Please.
Is this getting in the way of funding for this stuff? Or can you say, oh yeah, we're going to look at Martian?
In terms of, is it getting in the way of funding for archaeological digs? I don't think it's getting in the way of funding for archaeological digs. No, I do think that this is massively in the way of anyone trying to produce popular archaeological content. We were talking about Time Team. If you haven't seen Time Team was a fabulous British TV show about archaeology. Most every other archaeology TV show that's been produced is paranormally themed or pseudo-archaeological themed. And for the last several years, I've been trying to get a better archaeology TV show on air. I have talked to producers, I have talked to casting agents, and it always sort of hits the same road where if I don't want to toe this line, they're not interested in talking to me. And there's this very big presumption at the top of these television studios that they are only going to produce what sells, and they're only going to produce what they think people want to watch. And so I have been told in so many words that people don't want the real story, they want the fun stuff. And that is absolutely getting in the way of public archaeological education. Yes?
Why do you think it is that like only certain ancient civilizations like attracted conspiracy theories, like the Egyptians and the Mayans?
Yes. So the question is, and this is a very important question, why do only certain ancient civilizations attract all of these theories? The Egyptians, the Maya, we get a lot from Africa, we get a lot from Latin America. There's a very specific answer to this. The literature that Ancient Aliens has used is recycled, not just in the way that I've talked about tonight, but they are, during the 19th century, as Europeans were exploring and spreading out throughout the world, they kept encountering ruins, like the Maya ruins, like ruins in Asia. and throughout Africa. And they very specifically said, and there's a number of very deliberate and overt occasions where these European colonizers said, well, the local population couldn't have built this. They're too dumb, they're too ignorant, they're too lazy. There was sort of a deliberate colonial racism that went around and said all of these ancient ruins couldn't have been built by the local population, the indigenous population. And so we see in the 19th century a number of lost white race myths that start to show up. So we have this very specifically in the eastern half of the United States. There are Native American burial mounds and structures all over the eastern half that are earthen mounds. And this, in the 19th century, academic authorities talked about these mounds as being built by the mound builder race, which was a race that the Native Americans had chased away. This is actually embraced by Andrew Jackson when Andrew Jackson called for the removal of Native Americans beyond the Mississippi River in what became the Trail of Tears. One of the reasons Jackson said it was okay to remove Native Americans is because it wasn't their land anyway. And so they had chased off the mound builders, so Jackson felt that Americans were justified in chasing off the Native Americans. So in other words, these are old, very racist ideas. Ancient Aliens has in many times picked up the exact same claims for the exact same cultures, for the exact same structures, and they've just replaced lost white race with the grays. And people ask me a lot, actually, whether Ancient Aliens is racist. And I think it's an important question and it's a problematic question. I think most of the people attracted to the show aren't attracted to it because they're racist. I don't think that's what's going on in most of it. But I think there's an underlying issue here that's very important. And there are some very nasty quotes that I didn't put on my slides tonight from Eric von Däniken. Eric von Däniken once said that the black race was a failed alien experiment. There is some very overt and troubling racism underneath this stuff. Other questions? I promise to be less serious if I can be. Yes?
So most cultural historians and scholars have noted an increase in anti-intellectualism in American culture.
Yes.
Is this due to anti-intellectualism?
I think it is part of that broader web, yeah. It's hard. Anti-intellectualism is such a big move, or a big concept, and it's hard to piece it out. And so in essence, I try to deal with it by talking about this specifically. But I think that's also, to a certain extent, unfair to say that this is isolated, because this is not isolated from larger steps. There are some very explicit quotes. Graham Hancock, who I mentioned, who wrote about Mars, has a new book that came out just a few months ago. And in the press tour for that book, he talks repeatedly about how people like me should not be trusted. That the academics are just there to suppress the information and maintain the status quo. I promise you, if you want to be an archaeologist, the way to have a career in archaeology is to find something new and tell people about it. The last thing you can do in archaeology is hush things up and keep it quiet, because that is a recipe to no career whatsoever. But Hancock and others like him run around all the time saying that I'm just here trying to cover it up. If I could prove aliens came here, I would do it. Like, that would be fun, right? Like, how damn good would that be if you could be the one who proved that aliens came here? I would be on board if this evidence was good. This evidence is bad, and it's really bad. And so it is part of this big, wider web. And I don't know how to deal with that big, wider web. And so I narrow down and focus on this particular issue. Yes, please.
Is this just a similar progression? Because a lot of the advancements have come after stretches of lack of concrete advancement. And, what we held as truth before was not. And it seems like it's turning over faster and faster with our technology. Is this just another example?
There's a lot at stake here and a lot in place, and I think it's a lot has to do here with the stories we tell about ourselves and who we center in those stories and who we want to be the heroes of those stories. So we see a lot of historians of science who like to write about how religion and science have always been opposed. And that's one that's actually not true. If you go back, it's only really the last 100 years that we see like sort of major, massive loggerheads about this. Your example about the Earth being flat, this one I actually find interesting because I haven't seen hard numbers. We were talking about this. I don't know how many people are going flat earther right now. That's a whole big issue, but it's very prominent right now. But if we go back in time, flat Earth was not a thing. In Columbus's day, when Columbus was trying to see if he could sail from Europe to Asia, to India, no one was afraid he was going to sail off the Earth. What they were afraid of is that the Earth was too big and that he couldn't carry enough food and water to make it all the way there. Columbus was using a measurement to the size of the Earth that was suggested the Earth was about half the size that it actually is. And so he thought he could get there in half the time. And it turns out he was sort of right because the Americas were halfway in between India and Europe, and it sort of worked out for him. But he made 4 voyages to the Americas, and to his dying day thought he went to India. The idea that people were afraid Columbus would sail off the face of the earth came about in the 1900s, when Italian Americans were trying to elevate Christopher Columbus as this great culture figure, and to get Columbus Day named after him and whatnot. That was a story that people started to tell about Columbus, and sort of manufacturing this idea. And so I think a lot of this has to do with these, who are our heroes and who do we want to elevate? And that's where the question about the racist problems in this idea I see as inherently problematic. These stories elevate white European history and emphasize that white Europeans did good things, because trust me, they have not yet done the Roman Colosseum built by aliens episode yet on Ancient Aliens. They don't do those episodes. They'll bring in Stonehenge every once in a while, but they don't touch Greece, they don't touch Rome. Like, that stuff's fine, because that was made by sort of the architects of Western civilization. They're telling a story, though, that writes out all black and brown and indigenous populations around the world. And they're having a lot of success with that story right now. And I think what archaeologists and anthropologists are trying to do desperately is to say that other people outside of Europe have good stories to tell, and they have a real culture history behind them. And so I think this is a phase, but I think it's echoes of a very ugly phase. And hopefully, if we talk about it, it can be pushed aside. Other questions? Yes, please. So the question is about repatriation, right? In essence, whether artifacts should return to their home countries that they came from. There's lots of layers to this question, and we play them out in my classroom all the time. Legally, these are usually very hard questions. There's the questions of the Elgin marbles. These are the marbles that were on the Parthenon in Greece that are currently in the British Museum. England has always maintained they were exported legally, and they were. The Ottoman Empire gave Lord Elgin a permit to take these back to Britain with him, and so he did. And that, under international law at the time, was totally legal. A few years later, the Ottoman Empire fell, and Greece took itself back over and said, we want them back. We didn't say it was okay for them to leave our country. And so you have a very complicated intertemporal legal argument going on of not just, are you going to apply the law of today? Are you going to apply the law of yesterday? Are you going to apply the law of the Ottoman Empire? Legally, these are very hard questions. Although legally, I would say if you haven't seen one of the most eyebrow-raising news stories of Brexit lately, Greece got a line inserted into the Brexit negotiations saying that they wanted the Elgin marbles back, and that was one of the conditions of Brexit now. So we'll see how that plays out, because England has said for years, we're not giving them back, we're not giving them back. In fact, it gets really ugly sometimes. At one point, England said, well, Greece, you couldn't care for them if we gave them back to you. So Greece built an entire museum dedicated for these marbles to be returned. That museum sits today full of replicas, waiting for the real ones to come back, and somehow London still hasn't sent them back. Legally, it is a very complicated question. And I have friends who work in museums, and they are very concerned about maintaining their collections to maintain visitors and whatnot. And so I appreciate the legal complexities. That is not a simple question from a legal perspective. From a moral perspective, these things should go back. These things were taken at times when there was vast disproportionates in political and military power, and they were brought away from their home countries and their home cultures. And so I would like to see most of these things go back. It's legally more complex than that, but in my heart of hearts, if I could snap my fingers and make them go back, I would. Thank you all so much. Oh, please. No.
I guess kind of related to that question, in terms of preserving, histories, in areas that it was probably 5 years ago, that Timbuktu, when ISIS came through, destroying. I mean, are there organizations that people could donate to that we could have trust that they're going in and either trying to keep them where they should be and protect them there, or doing things to preserve them?
Yeah.
Because it's happening in places like China and other countries where they may be trying to use things, to suppress, instead of go in and just destroy relics and other artifacts.
So in essence, the question is, what can we do about this, right? When we see sites being destroyed and artifacts being destroyed, there's lots to talk about here too. One of the things I would like to emphasize: this is happening in the Middle East. This is happening in Asia. This is also happening right here. Construction companies bulldoze Native American sites with some regularity. I think at home, what you can do, I would say you should be looking at the Society for American Archaeology and the Archaeological Institute of America. These are both very well-organized professional organizations that fight for awareness of these issues and fight to help raise money to protect these sites and whatnot. I think there's another thing that you shouldn't do, and this is, I think, an important story in all, is that you shouldn't buy antiquities. And that might seem like an obvious thing, but if you go onto eBay tonight and Google antiquities or Google ancient Egypt or something like that, you will find a bunch of stuff. First things first, most of it's fake, and they're just stealing your money. But not all of it is. And here's the thing: you asked about ISIS. ISIS got a lot of attention a couple of years ago when they started blowing up archaeological sites. They would videotape these things and blow up archaeological sites. They destroyed Palmyra and several other famous archaeological sites. And we saw emotional outcry and tears across the globe because we lost irreplaceable things. That was theater. They knew what they were doing. Because at the same time that they were blowing up sites and recording it and sending those recordings all around the world, they were looting those sites and selling the artifacts on the black market. Americans bought thousands of artifacts off of Facebook a couple of years ago. And Americans bought thousands of artifacts off of Facebook and funded ISIS in a result. Americans were funding ISIS by buying antiquities. This is one of the things you can not do, right? You can support the legitimate organizations. You can look out and not buy antiquities. You can not support the destruction of the archaeological record. Thank you all so much for your time, your attention. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much.